And joining me this evening is Jared McCabe from Wakeland Property Advisory. I'm not sure how to introduce Jared, actually. I mean, I would regard him as really one of the best buyers agents in Australia. I don't want to embarrass him, but truly, and if I think back, why do I hold that opinion? It's really about, what I value is technical smarts and experience. And Jared's been a buyer's agent for more than 15 years. And, a lot of buyer's agents, their core competencies really around salesmanship rather than understanding what makes a great investment property. And that's not Jared. But it's not all good news. He's an Essendon supporter, which means he advocates using performance-enhancing drugs to win at sport, although that hasn't really worked for Essendon.
No.
But welcome, Jared.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to join you. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, before we get going, obviously we're going to cover the top 5 mistakes. You can use the chat function to ask any questions. I mean, Jared and I could talk for the rest of the evening, so I'm not sure that we'll have plenty of room to get to a lot of questions or comments, but feel free to use the chat function. And I think one of my team members, Ivy, is lurking around the background, so if you've got any technical issues, certainly address them to her. But I wanted to start this evening really just by painting the picture to really talk about why is capital growth or selecting the right property the key element. And really, it's really about, I'm just going to try and share this now. It's really about the difference in compounding capital growth over a long period of time. Now, this chart shows what happens over 20 years, but I mean, if you extrapolate it over a longer period of time, it's even more stark. And what it shows is $1 million property at 6, 7, 8, or 9% compounding capital growth. And remember, the median over a long period of time is around about 7-ish%. That obviously includes inflation, of course, but that's the midpoint, which means 50% of properties grew slower than that rate, but also 50% of properties grew faster than 7%. So hopefully by applying what I talk about in the podcast a lot, a rules-based approach, an evidence-based approach, you hope to outperform the median. And so, if that's 7 versus 8% or 7 versus 9%, who knows what it's going to be. But in 20 years' time, you're going to look back and go, did I get that decision right? Did I buy the right asset? And the problem with buying a great asset, or the challenge, I guess, is with buying a great asset, is it's not always obvious. That you can make a mistake, and it's not always obvious that you're making that mistake. And so that's why I thought tonight's topic was going to be a really good topic to share with everyone, because then we can really talk about the key mistakes that we make, and hopefully help people avoid making those mistakes, Jared.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, without further ado, let's get into them. And in no particular order, the first mistake we really want to talk about is floor plan. And I wanted to start with floor plan because I think it's one of the things that, people sort of undervalue or don't realize how important it is. And it certainly took me a bit of time, and a bit of experience to work out how critical a floor plan was. And if the floor plan is not right, to sort of move on to the next asset. So, Jared, when selecting an investment grade asset, what are the things that you want to think about when looking at a particular floor plan?
I think, and this can sound quite generic, Stuart, but flow is a really important, and we talk about that around the office quite a lot, and how a floor plan flows and how it connects. And because we're predominantly talking about investment grade properties, we'll be talking, particularly from a Melbourne perspective, I'll be focusing more on sort of terrace houses, apartments, villa units, that sort of thing. So from a terrace house perspective, and obviously different properties have different requirements, and what's considered good for one type of property may not be a good floor plan for another. But flow is really important, and connectivity. So what you don't want, and you see this quite regularly, say, for instance, with terrace houses where people want more bedrooms. So more is better is the mindset, which is not true. And so rooms get added on at the rear, and then all of a sudden you've got bedroom, living, kitchen, bathroom, and another bedroom tacked on at the back. And all of a sudden the flow and the connectivity from the bedrooms to the living space and then to the outdoor space doesn't work. And then, so buyers and tenants, well, buyers more so to start with, then look at that and say, well, this doesn't work. And if I'm going to pursue this, I'm going to have to spend money. And it's not money that's going to add value. There's going to be a lot of things that need to recreate that property, which then costs a lot. Whereas if you can get things right, and this is what we'll expand on a little bit further around floor plan, if you can get the fundamentals right of the floor plan to start with, then you can spend money on areas where you will get return on investment with minimal expense.
Yeah, because obviously changing a floor plan is expensive, right? Typically moving load-bearing walls potentially, or making some significant changes to property. Whereas I guess, am I right? If we were going to buy a property, we probably only want to make cosmetic changes, if anything.
Structural changes around load bearing and things is a big thing, but having to move plumbing is probably one of the major expenses too. So having to, again, using terrace houses as an example, quite often the bathroom from an original perspective was at the rear of the property. So you would ideally, in a lot of circumstances, prefer the bathroom to be in the middle of the house. And that's an expensive exercise to have to do that, because you're not just going to choose a room in the middle of the house and make that the bathroom. You're then going to have to reconfigure the rear section and redo that as well. And that is a significant expense, particularly with the way building costs have gone over the past 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah. Well, you shared a couple of floor plans with me, and I might just share the unconventional one to begin with, Jared. Maybe you can kind of walk us through that. Why is it so unconventional? Why is it not going to work?
So it's more towards the rear with this one. I mean, the front 2 bedrooms are pretty traditional with a terrace house. That's what you'd expect. And then you get to the lounge room around the middle, and there's very minimal natural light with the way that's been now structured, because those courtyards provide a little bit of light for a middle bedroom, which is workable. But from that lounge room's perspective, there's no natural light to that. So that's a concern there. The kitchen becomes a thoroughfare to get in and out. It's very much that galley style kitchen. It's most likely a step down to that too. We can see with that arrow from the dining room into the kitchen. So that's not ideal either. And there'll be no natural light for that kitchen unless there's been some skylights put in at the top. And then there's obviously access externally, but you can go through the laundry out to the bathroom. So the main concern that I've got with that is not so much the bathroom at the back, because you can still make that workable, providing there's a detachment from the remainder of the house, having a bathroom at the rear. It's mainly the natural light or lack of to the lounge and the dining, and the fact that the kitchen's a thoroughfare along that side.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to unshare that, and we're going to go with a balanced one then. As a good sort of comparison. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, why is that going to work?
So there's a number of reasons why this one. Obviously, the money's been spent on this one. You can see that the bathroom's been centralised, so that would have been at the rear, not dissimilar to the previous one at one stage. And what's happened with that previous one, was that they've just basically, instead of spending money, they've just tacked things on to try and make it better. Whereas with this one, someone's gone to the expense of pulling the back off the house, putting the bathroom in the middle, creating a second living zone, which shouldn't be undervalued in that dining space there. A lot of places would convert that to a third bedroom, which would be more of a nursery, but I think it's almost more beneficial to have it as a second living zone, because that kitchen living at the rear works really, really well. And then you've still got an outdoor entertaining area. The other thing with this one, and I do remember buying this property, is that from a floor plan perspective, is that solid wall, which is the party wall at the top of the screen, is actually the south side. So, this is where you'd actually get, this is probably the ideal floor plan and ideal layout for this type of property. And a lot of people talk about north facing rear. And for a family home where you've got a large portion of your frontage and rear allows for a lot of light to stream in, that's true. But when you've got a terrace house, the biggest dimension on the property is actually the side boundaries. So to have that with a property like this, it lets a lot of natural light into the middle of the house, and then you can maximize still coming in at the rear. So this was it's one of the closest thing you'll get to probably an ideal floor plan with a terrace house, this one.
Yeah, perfect. And I imagine, with those terrace houses, when they were first constructed, the bathroom probably would have been out separate to the dwelling. Is that right? And so
absolutely. Had to go outside. Yeah, absolutely. And then and then so that's where there's been sort of tack-ons to try and connect them together. And sometimes that can be done reasonably well so that it can still work. But the one that you showed earlier, that's certainly one of the ones where the tack-ons just haven't worked.
And what about bedroom sizes? The other thing that I was really kind of took me back when I first sort of learned about it or realized that bedroom sizes can have a big impact in terms of the marketability and demand of a property. So, is it about the orientation? Is it about the particular size? And if it's size, what is kind of the minimum that you would accept?
So again, yeah, size is very relevant. And again, it comes to different types of property have different sizes. So for instance, if you look at an Art Deco apartment, it's very common with an Art Deco apartment to have one massive oversized bedroom and the second bedroom to be quite undersized. So it's almost like a one bedroom and a study. But the second bedroom could be as small as 3x3 and sometimes even smaller, but 3x3 is still workable as a second bedroom. When that's the expectation. So understanding that that's the expectation for an Art Deco apartment and knowing that that's what you typically get. Whereas 3x3 or sometimes 3x2.8 is for a terrace house is again not unusual, but not what you would want to accept. And then you'll quite often see with cottages and terrace houses that you'll have two good size rooms like we saw at the front, and then that third bedroom will be more of a nursery type or a study third option. And again, if you've got two good sized bedrooms that are perhaps 3x3.5 or bigger, then that's okay to have the third bedroom being small. But if you've got two bedrooms that are 3x2.5, then you're really probably going to be compromising and perhaps not what you really want to be looking at.
So there's probably no such thing as a perfect property necessarily, or perfect that's going to appeal to every single person. But how critical is floor plan in terms of asset selection? Are there any compromises that that is okay to make, or is it really just about it's either black or white? It's a good floor plan or it's not.
No, I mean, no property. You're exactly right. No property's 10 out of 10. So there's not going to be anything that's perfect. As I said, that one before was probably as close as you'll get. Because of the orientation as well. But it's understanding what the market expects to in a certain area. So what's acceptable in one location from a floor plan point of view may not be in another. So, and again, using that bathroom at the rear from a terrace perspective, if you're looking at a terrace house in Albert Park, that's not going to be accepted by the market. The market expects things to be centralized unless you've got a small sector of the market that's looking for something that they can extend and renovate themselves. But generally, the market there expects things to have been centralized and have open plan living at the back. Whereas if you go to Brunswick, as an example, the bathroom at the rear is far more acceptable there. And if there's detachment from, say, the kitchen, and we talked before about the bathroom being at the back and there being connections going through, as long as there's some separation, there's still another way to access the rear yard, and you don't have the kitchen leading directly off the bathroom without any separation, that can still work. And that's still, and that's where you might accept that as a compromise, because you're still in a really good street. You've still got a nice backyard. You've got good sized bedrooms. The kitchen and the bathroom are in good condition, and there's still ways that you can add value without necessarily needing to centralize that. So, and good properties like that are also becoming harder and harder to find because there's been significant renovations done on a lot of those terrace houses where they've had the first floor extension added on. And so that's taken them into a totally different price bracket. So where that property still functions quite well as a two bedroom and is still probably more in the entry level category means that there can be quite strong demand for that, because otherwise it wouldn't be affordable to as many people.
Yeah, understand. And so if we have a not a perfect floor plan, a suboptimal or weird sort of floor plan, what's the impact? Is it likely to impact capital growth or rental yield or both? What is that?
Both. Yeah. I mean, if you've got something that doesn't have the optimal floor plan on it, and it's not something that's easily rectifiable, then it can certainly impact so if we start from a tenancy perspective, tenants are going to look at it and say, well, there's no separation there, particularly if, say, you've got two singles wanting to rent a property. There's no separation. We've only got one tiny little living space that doesn't balance well, and therefore that's not going to be workable for us as two singles. We've got to basically live in our bedrooms. If you've got kids and there's no separation, the bedroom leads off the living space. There's no separation there as well. And so that limits your return on investment in that side of things, and limits the competition. And then from a capital value point of view, we've certainly seen in the last 4 to 5 years where there's been a change in market demand. And look, this will change again, but because the cost of carrying out renovations has been so expensive, the demand for turnkey property has been a lot stronger. And so compromised floor plans where significant amounts of money needs to be spent on a property has not worked well. And when a market hasn't been overly strong, particularly in Melbourne over the past 4 to 5 years, that makes it even harder to sell those sorts of properties and restricts their growth even further. So yeah, it absolutely impacts things. Absolutely does.
So if you summarised in terms of a good floor plan, would it be, sort of natural light, natural kind of flow, livability and size? Would that sort of summarise the key attributes?
The one thing I didn't mention before, which I think is really important around floor plan, is balance. And I think that goes to the number of bedrooms, to the number of bathrooms, to the living space. And particularly as some houses are extended and renovated, sometimes, as I said, it can just be that we want an extra bedroom, or we want an extra bedroom and a bathroom, so we need to put that in, without thinking that what else does the property need to have in order to accommodate that. And we see quite regularly that an extra bedroom is added. So it might go from a 2 to a 3 or a 3 to a 4, but the living space doesn't change. And all of a sudden, we've got an extra person or an extra 2 people that might be residing in that property, but the living space isn't there to accommodate that. So all of a sudden, the property becomes undesirable because it doesn't have a balanced floor plan. Or it might be that you go from 3 bedrooms to 4 bedrooms and the living space is adequate, but people then say, well, 4 bedrooms, I've got 4, maybe 5 people living here. I've only got 1 bathroom. I need to have another bathroom. So it's taking all of that into account. The balance is really important from a floor plan point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how people can make a mistake, can't you? I mean, they buy a great property in a great suburb in a great street, but then the last little step, that floor plan sort of trips them up. But it's easy to think, oh, that's not a big deal. It's just the improvements. The underlying land is what everyone's interested in. But that's true as long as you don't have to go to great expense to make it livable. But
yeah, and we talk about that, and we'll talk about that from a return perspective. But it sometimes becomes that worst house in best street type analogy. But sometimes the worst house is that for a reason, and it's not easily rectifiable to bring it back to being just as good as everything else. So it's not always as simple as, we've got the land, we've got the location, because there's other factors around investment property. Yes, the land is really, really important, and being in a great street is a really, really good start. But there's other factors as well.
Yeah, understand. All right, let's get into the second mistake, which is really the wrong budget, Jared. So what are some of the common mistakes that you see in terms of setting a budget for a particular location?
Well, we have a lot of conversations with yourself and your team around this sort of stuff too, because budget is so important about that. But the one thing that, and I was speaking to one of my colleagues this morning about this, and the one thing that we do quite often here is the bank said I can borrow $1 million, but I only want to spend 700. So, and then we go through the discussion as to why that's the case and what's the reasoning behind that. Oh, I don't feel comfortable spending that sort of money, and I think I can still get what I want for that sort of budget, and I'll feel a lot more comfortable. I can still do all this. So our big point to that is, well, have you done the appropriate homework leading into this discussion before coming and speaking to us? Because it's really important to understand that. And I'm guessing, and I know, well, I'm not guessing, I know from when you and your team speak to people, if the bank has said you can borrow and spend $1 million, it's hard enough to get that out of them in the first place. So if the bank's saying that, they're generally pretty comfortable that you've got the capacity to do that. Now, whether or not you want to or not is another matter. But the key part from our perspective is that what you may be doing, and not always the case, if you're going from $2 million down to 1.7, I'm still going to be able to get you something really good. But if you're going from $1 million down to 700, you're changing the type of property that you're buying. And that's where the key part comes in. You're going from potentially being able to buy a good little cottage or a terrace in, say, a Footscray type location to buying an apartment. Now, apartments, as you and I have spoken about this, and I know you've spoken to your podcast a hell of a lot about this, haven't performed overly well in Melbourne over the past 7 to 10 years particularly. And there's more consistency from a housing perspective, and there's probably scope for the apartment market. But if you've got the capacity to be in that $1 million price range, or perhaps a little bit more, and you're pulling yourself back because you don't think you really want to spend that, then you're doing yourself a disservice.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because that's a question I often get if I do a podcast. I did one recently about the apartment market. Well, and then people get excited. "Oh, let's go and buy an apartment." But if they've got the capacity to buy something, a higher quality asset than an apartment, then we should obviously talk about that. So let's unpack that a little bit, Jared. So if I've got the capacity, say, to spend one and a half, why wouldn't I go and buy two $700,000 apartments versus a $1 million house?
So I would go down. I mean, and again, that changes again if you go up another price bracket. So if you said, oh, it's 2.5, why wouldn't I buy two at 1.25? And that would change my mind. At that sort of price, I would start having discussions around buying two properties. But I've been having this conversation with people for years and years and years about that sort of option. And because of the scarcity that houses offer, it's at a greater rate than what it is for apartments. That's why I would go down that path. There's greater land component, there's greater certainty around that side of things than there is around that apartment market, and you've got a lot more risk of. And look, it's less likely at the moment, and I know you've put this in your podcast that that's why I think there is some scope for apartments to grow, and I think there will be some over the coming sort of 3 to 5 years, particularly. But there's still scope for more apartments to be constructed, whereas there's no scope for more terrace houses to be constructed.
So, to your mind, putting the financial consideration, which is kind of a stupid thing to say, right? Because it's mostly driven by financial considerations in terms of affordability and so forth. But like, how should people approach the budget sort of question? Is it really just about spending as much as possible on the highest quality asset they can buy, or is it really just trying to get into a house over an apartment? Like, how would you sort of navigate that
Up
budget?
to a point, it's getting in as high as you can. But if you then go too high, then you're starting to get into a sector where perhaps there's not as much, not as many buyers in that space. And so you're starting to move into another. So if you've got the capacity to go from, say, 1.1 mil in a house up to 1.5, that's going to take you from perhaps a suburb that may have a few more compromises to it to something where there's far more certainty and far more demand, and the desirability might be increased. So you've got, and your multifaceted demand probably expands further too, which means there's greater scope, even in downtimes, to have more consistent levels of growth and more consistent levels of demand for that type of property. But once you start to get up into the high ones, pushing two, it starts to be a discussion around, well, and that's where we would have a chat with yourselves or with the client to find out, okay, what other residential property assets, if any, do you hold? And where are they? And if you've got multiple others, well, then perhaps a single one's worth looking at, but maybe it's worth considering buying two once we start to get up to those sorts of levels. But we need to understand the financial strategy too, and that's why it's really important to understand where else that's coming from.
Yeah, coincidentally, my colleague Campbell's going to publish a podcast in a couple of weeks' time talking about all the things that we think about when setting a property budget, because I think it's one of the things, it's a really important thing, right? Because you've got to live with it for as long as you own the property. And if you don't get that budget right, you could forego you in terms of capital growth or livability if it's a house, whatever it might be. I tend to think that, you're better off to set the budget and then think about the asset that suits that budget. Whereas I think people fall in love with the idea of the asset first and then try and make the budget work within that asset. So I want to go and buy a house in Hawthorne, but my budget's only, $1 million. How do I do that? And the problem with doing it that way is that you end up making too many compromises and you end up with a substandard asset. So I think budget's really important. The other thing that I would share from conversations with clients over the last sort of 20 years is that they will select a great buyer's agent and their budget is 1.5, but they'll just go to the buyer's agent and say it's 1.3. They'll leave a little bit up their sleeve, like there's an incentive for the buyer's agent to spend to the full budget. Which I think, I understand the thought process behind it, but, I think if you've got the right person isn't just going to spend the money just because it's there. But having a little bit of flexibility and agility around budget, I think is really good too, in my experience and experience with clients. So if we set a budget and we tell Jared it's 1.5, but there's a great asset for 1.6, can we push to 1.6? Is that comfortable? We need to be flexible enough to not throw the strategy out and redo it all again, but we need to kind of accommodate the market a little bit, because we could end up getting, paying 1.6 for something that intrinsic value might be a little bit higher than that, and we've bought ourselves a really good asset. So I think, it's not the more you spend, the better the quality asset you're going to get, not necessarily, but as a general theme, I think that's right. And quality makes a big difference, of course. The next mistake we're going to talk about, Jared, is, trying to chase two rabbits and catching neither.
Yeah.
So, really about trying to optimize income and also trying to optimize growth. Now, one of the criticisms, I guess, not a criticism, observation sometimes that I get on the podcast is that, okay, it's great if you've got heaps of income, you don't need to worry about rental yield. Of course, then you can go and buy a house for 1.7 with a 1.5% rental yield, because you don't need to worry about it, of course, but not everyone can do that. And I obviously acknowledge that. So for some people, to minimize the holding costs, rental income is important.
Really important.
So how do you go about kind of finding that balance between, well, I mean, ultimately it's trying to achieve the highest return over a long period of time, but so how do you sort of balance that?
So it's understanding the drivers of each, of growth versus rental return, and it's understanding that they actually work at cross purposes. So what drives growth isn't what drives yield. In fact, it's the opposite. So what drives growth is that underlying land value, which you mentioned before, and we speak about that on a very regular basis. But what drives yield is typically the improvements. So tenants pay for nice kitchens, nice bathrooms, that sort of thing. That's what they want, and living space and car accommodation, that type of thing. And that's important from a yield perspective. You need to have those sorts of things, but it's not what's going to help you achieve that financial independence that you speak about regularly from a wealth creation point of view. So it's understanding what drives each of them and then trying to get the balance. So the focus absolutely needs to be on the capital growth and on the land component, on the scarcity value, on the multifaceted demand, all those sorts of things. But understanding that there's ways and means that you can increase rental yield once you take possession of the right asset. So you can, if you buy the right property and get the things right that you can't change about the property. So you can't change the location, you can't change the orientation, you typically can't change the style of property. And we don't really want to have to change the floor plan significantly because that's going to be too expensive too. But we can upgrade a kitchen, we can upgrade a bathroom, we can paint, we can change floor coverings, we can change window furnishings, we can change light fittings, we can upgrade courtyards. We can do all those sorts of things. In some instances, you can maybe even add car parking to a terrace house if you've got the right type of property. So there's those sorts of things that you can change, and those sorts of things will increase your rental return. So you can absolutely add that sort of side of things, and typically you'll get pretty good return on investment in terms of spending money on a property that's perhaps undervalued. A property I mentioned to you on the weekend that we purchased, Stuart, that needs things done to it, and it's going to need work done to the property to improve it. But it's going to accept that well, and it's going to provide return on investment when it's needed, probably in 5-10 years' time. It's very rentable in its current state. But you can add value, and that'll be increasing capital value, but it'll also be significantly increasing the yield and the rental return as well.
I mean, I don't know if you can answer this question, but so I'll ask it anyway. But I'm just trying to find really where the balance of yield and growth, how to sort of balance that out from an investment perspective, particularly, more recently, higher interest rate environment, credit has tightened since 2017 quite a lot. I mean, if I think back to, 10 or 15, 20 years ago, it was always the case that banks will lend you a lot more than you probably should borrow.
Yeah.
Whereas today, that's not the case. It's probably 50-50, that 50% of borrowers could probably safely, conservatively afford to borrow more, but it's because of credit policy that's really holding them back. So if I was in a situation where I could go and buy a house, on a 2% yield, but my budget's only 1.1, versus I could spend that little bit more, say 2.3, 2.4, but I needed a high yield. I needed to target a property with more improvements in order to do that, to push my borrowing capacity. I don't want to get too stuck up in the numbers, but, kind of generally get my theme. What do you think as a general rule? How should I spend more? Because then I've invested more, of course, and if the return is the same, then I'm going to be better off. But do you get the sort of theme of what I'm trying to ask?
Look, what I would be trying to do, if yield is important to me as a buyer, and I still want to get a growth focused asset, but I really need to maximize the yield I possibly can, as much as I possibly can. I would look to be buying something that's fundamentally got the right attributes to it, but that is quite dated, because I feel like, and then buying it for within my budget. So if I've got 1.1, I'd be going to an area where I feel like I could buy that house for around $1 million. That's dated and not great, and keeping that 100 grand up my sleeve, and hope, and if I do it the right way, I can upgrade kitchens and bathrooms within that budget, and I can increase the yield far more than what the $100,000 extra expense on top would be. And that way I'm still getting what I need to. I'm not paying a premium for someone else's renovation, which is what you'll end up doing if you spend that max. But I can increase the value of the property and also increase my rental return.
Yeah, gotcha. I mean, I hate to be a nerdy accountant here as well, but you also get the depreciation.
Yeah.
So for the improvements that you make, which is going to help your sort of after-tax holding costs of that particular property as well. Not the reason you do it, but it does really help the cash flow. I know we're running a bit behind time, but I just want to ask you this, Jared. I'm sure you see it all the time as well, where some buyers agents are advertising, "Oh, we bought this property. It's a 4%, 4.5% yield. We bought it, 3 years ago during COVID. The property's just had a valuation. It's $300,000 worth, more than what we paid. So the client's got high yield and quite a bit of capital growth. How should people sort of respond? What sort of questions should they be asking when they see something like that?
Yeah, there's some very, very good questions to be asked around those sorts of things. Look, I mean, sometimes you can be very fortunate and things can jump in value over a period of time, and the argument from those advocates would be, well, that's because I knew what I was doing and I picked the right time. But I would be probably getting your valuation done pretty quickly, and perhaps even selling the property pretty quickly if it's done that over that period of time, because I've seen a lot of property that was valued towards the end of COVID, particularly in regional parts of this country, that had significant periods of growth. I've also then seen what they've done in the 2 or 3 years post, and they haven't been well. I mean, there's pockets in and around regional Victoria. I've got a very good friend who's a real estate agent in regional Victoria, and he's been doing it been an agent for 30 plus years, and he's having conversations with clients at the moment where he says the first time in 30 plus years where he's actually having to tell people that what they paid for properties, their property's not worth that anymore. And that's not off the plan type properties. That's properties that would typically have appreciated in some form, and they're just not. So, and that's because of the artificial growth. So that's what you've got to be very careful with. It's the art. Has there been some form of artificial inflation with that type of scenario? And is it sustainable to continue on at those sorts of levels?
Yep. Awesome. Fantastic. All right. Mistake number 4 is hotspotting, Jared. I mean, probably one of our favorites, but
yep.
If I'm going to be devil's advocate, why shouldn't I go and find a location? There's a lot of data available now in terms of demographic data. There's a lot of data around property price movement, all that sort of stuff, population growth. Maybe I can use all that data to my advantage to, pinpoint or find a location that I think is going to benefit from a significant growth cycle, as opposed to, again, being devil's advocate. If I look at a blue chip, well-established suburb, it's becoming less affordable. So why shouldn't I use that hotspotting approach?
And look, and there's a lot of people that follow that narrative. I think that the risk with the hotspot approach is that how long is it going to take before it actually does start to perform? And that's always the concern. It can be that the data is telling me this, and there's this project that's going on there, or there's changing market dynamics. A big one is always around infrastructure changes. If there's been something that's changed from a new hospital or a new road or a train line or something along those lines, that's going to make this area far more accessible, and therefore the growth is going to be there. The risks with it are that it could take a significant amount of time. But what we've also seen, particularly with the infrastructure changes, is that quite often, once that sort of sugar hit has worn off, that it reverts back to its previous levels of performance, and so the growth isn't then consistent. Versus, and people ask around the blue chip side of things. Well, the reason blue chip suburbs are, in fact, that is because they're aspirational suburbs too. And so people want to be there. So you may not be able to afford to buy your first home or even your second home in some of these locations. But at some point in time, you, with wealth creation over a period of time, you aspire to be there. And there's reasons that they want to be there, whether it's if you're in Sydney, it might be water views, access to. In Melbourne, big one is education facilities, and a lot of the eastern suburbs are based around that. And so having access to those sorts of services and the green streets and the access and the public transport linkages is really important. So there's a reason blue chip is blue chip, and because of that aspirational nature of them, people want to be there and are going to continue to want to be there over a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a bit about, what will drive future growth, and really looking back over the last 30 years, there's been a big change in the banking industry and borrowing capacity, really from, the 1980s through to, the most recent decade. And that has certainly propelled prices forward, but I can't see that happening or repeating itself over the next few decades. So really prices have to be more closely linked with incomes as opposed to borrowing capacity,
Yeah.
and indebtedness. And I think, those blue chip locations typically are driven by a lot of things, including income, household income, of course, but, inheritance, business, or a lot of employee shares. I mean, it's really surprising these days that people, I mean, you can work in Melbourne and work for a US tech company and,
Yeah.
earn double your salary just in employee shares that they seem to give away for nothing. So, these things do happen. They do actually have a big impact on, those aspirational areas where people actually want to live. So what about the ripple effect, Jared? If
Yep.
I say, look, Hawthorne, great suburb, awesome, but can't afford it. What about the adjoining suburbs? Is that a way to sort of think about it? So should I then, think about investing in an adjoining suburb, or should I make a compromise, instead of buying a house in Hawthorne, buy an apartment? How
So
would you kind of weigh up that?
yeah, so the ripple effect is definitely a thing, and it's definitely worth considering the next suburb out. But the thing to be very mindful of is that the fundamentals typically change, and it might not be significant, but they change a little bit by little bit as you go out. And I use the example of, say, East Melbourne to Fitzroy. So East Melbourne's very much full of Victorian terrace houses, mostly 2-story, some older style apartments, and it's one of the most high land value areas in the city. Fitzroy, when you go over Victoria Parade, is very similar. The first until you get to Gertrude Street is full of those 2-story Victorians. Then you go a bit further out, and they take the commission flats out. That's got nothing to do with it. But then you go into single fronted cottages and terraces. You go over Queen's Princess Street, and you go into Fitzroy proper, and it changes to terrace houses. Then you go to Northcote, and it's cottages more so than terrace houses. And then it goes into Thornbury and it's double fronts. And then you go into Preston and it's wider again. So it changes bit by bit as you go out. And so, but what you've got to be careful is once you get to say, to certain spots, whether it's Preston or whether it's other ways, you might go out to the east, you might go to the west. It gets to a point where there's no longer that type of property that is the investment type strategy, or there's no longer the period homes. And so the dynamic of that market changes significantly. So the ripple effect is in terms of where to select, or the bridesmaid suburb, which a lot of people talk about. It's definitely a consideration. It's definitely something to look at. But you need to be mindful that things change the further out you go. Public transport's another really good one, in that villa units is an example. I did our podcast last week on them, and they can be really good options, but they're typically middle ring suburb locations. And when you get into Camberwell, Surrey Hills, Box Hill, Blackburn, Nunawading, the public transport is fanning out. You can be very isolated in some of those locations. So a villa unit is a great option, but geographically, you need to make sure that you're selecting that right spot if you're going that ripple further and further out.
Yeah, so I guess then, would I be correct in saying that an apartment in a pure blue chip location is going to be better than a house in a secondary or third location?
Depending upon where that house is, potentially, yes. Because if
Yeah.
you're going too far out and you're in an isolated location, even though you do have that land component, you may be foregoing that the strong underlying land value, the scarcity value, and you may be limiting your buyer profile in terms of how many different buyer profiles are interested from a demand point of view as well, which is another important component.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's, I talk in my book Investopoly, talk about the three ways to kind of make money: speculation, investing, and business. Just as sort of three broad categories, if you like. And investing really is about trying to achieve the highest return for the absolute lowest risk. And speculation's different, right? You're trying to, sort of shoot for the stars. You want double-digit returns, and you're prepared to take much higher risk. And I don't put those two options in completely the different camps, but very similar. Hotspotting, to my mind, is a speculative strategy.
Yeah.
If we're really interested in investing, I think most people are, they're quite happy to earn 7, 8, 9% compounding over a very long period of time, as long as they don't have to take too much risk.
Yeah.
And if that sounds like you, then hotspotting's probably not the way to go. Okay, so last mistake that we are going to talk about is personal likes and dislikes. And just to kick it off, I've got a bit of a story. A very, very long time ago, Richard Wakeland bought a one-bedroom Art Deco apartment for me. And at the time, I looked at Art Deco. I thought, I think it's ugly. I don't understand what the appeal is. But, this guy knows what he's doing. And it actually, looking back now, it's a fantastic property. I actually got a much, much greater appreciation. I actually like Art Deco now, so it's changed. But I thought it was a really good story to sort of say, it's about investing. It's about making money. It's about generating return, not necessarily falling in love with the property. So what are some of the common things that, likes and dislikes that people will come and tell you about, Jared?
So we quite regularly, and I think you mentioned earlier, we get a number of clients that will come in and they'll want to try and buy a property that meets multiple purposes, whether it's kids going to university, town base, those sorts of things, and it's putting their own. But I need it to have this, this, and this because that's what I like. And then I say to them, well, okay, but that's not what we need from a fundamentals perspective, from a growth point of view. So you need to decide which way we're going here. Are we going down the lifestyle property for you that you like and that you want, or are we going down the investment path that buys us something? And so once you narrow that down, it helps. But it's again, it comes across as well, and we see it. I see it a lot from a regional client perspective. A lot of our regional clients will say, I can't understand why you'd want to live in a two-bedroom house that's on 150 square meters, where side by side it's too small and it's tight. So, well, you don't have to live in it. It's not for you to live in. And if you don't come down and look at the property ever again, then that's fine, as long as it does what it needs to and you've got tenants lined up, and you will have tenants lined up to live in this. So you won't have any issues. The property that I mentioned before that we bought on the weekend, the agent stood up at the auction, and they all do this, but I know this guy, and he would have been telling the truth. That the previous owners had this property for 20 years, and he said there's not a day that they've had this that it had been vacant because it was the right property to buy. So understanding that is really important, and taking out the emotional elements around, well, like you said, I don't like Art Deco, or if you're buying in apartments, I don't like mid-century architecture, 1950s apartments are ugly, I want Art Deco, or I want something cutting edge modern. It's not about what you do and don't like, it's about what's going to work. So yeah, and then we'll have, from time to time, we'll have people say, well, I really want an Art Deco apartment and I don't need a car space. Well, you may not need a car space, but a lot of other people do, and you'll rule out a lot of potential buyers because they won't consider something that doesn't have a car space. So those are the sorts of things that we see time and time again, those personal preferences that need to be taken out of the consideration when making this sort of a decision.
Yeah, I mean, when we when we hand over a client to you and give you a brief, we try and keep it as wide as possible. It's really just about budget and nothing else, not even about yield or anything else. And, if clients start to become interested in something else, we want to try and educate them to say, look, just let the experts do the best that they can. The funny thing is that I've, come to realize is that there's certain things that are acceptable in some locations aren't acceptable in another. So, I mean, one of the things that sometimes people have are just a dislike for weatherboard properties, weatherboard houses, for instance.
Yep.
And in some locations you wouldn't buy them. I know you've said that before, Jared. And also in different locations, I know a floor plan that is acceptable in Brisbane, it would do your head in Melbourne. Like they're just, some of those Queenslanders are a bit strange. So is there any situations where you would say, you should try and include personal preferences, or is it very much, would your advice be, like if you were sitting in my chair, would your advice just be, go and find me the best property? Like how are you going to deal with the buyer's agent to give
that's
them a wide brief?
the best way to do it is to just, if you trust your property advisor, let them do their thing. Let them, or if you're doing it, I mean, again, take me out of it. If you're doing it yourself, take your personal preferences out of it and implement a key strategy. If you want to do this yourself and you want to go and secure the right property, you need to make sure you understand what the market wants in that location and take your own personal preferences out. I use the analogy quite regularly of in Fitzroy, being within 50 metres of a pub is a highly sought after thing. So if you can be nice and close to the Napier or the Rose or one of those great pubs, people really want that. But if you're too close to the Elgin in Hawthorn, no, we don't want to be anywhere near it. So you need to understand what your market wants and work with those preferences, even if they don't seem right for your own personal choice.
Yeah, look, I think, choosing the advisor is critical, and then trusting that advisor. Sometimes I find, or over the years, I've seen people go, oh, this is a good strategy. This is a good investment strategy, whether it's share market investing or super or whatever, but it's just not fancy enough for them. So they'll like to add their little bit, their little 5%.
Yeah.
And as a result, just sort of ruin it. Property really is, part art, part science. And that's why we can't necessarily just give you a checklist to say, here's 5 mistakes and here's the 26 things you need to check, just to make sure that you're not going to make a mistake, because there are idiosyncrasies. What is acceptable in one location is not acceptable in another. And you really need to understand the market. Well, that's been really good, Jared. And just to summarize for people, the 5 mistakes, floor plan. I think floor plans are a really big one that trips up a lot of people. You want to find that Goldilocks budget, just spending the right amount, not too much, but not too little. And I think probably the general observation from my perspective is that people tend to be too conservative with their budget. And remember, it's about percentage return. So the more I invest holding the return the same, the more money I'm going to make. Now, I know that's easy for me to say because it's not my money, but of course that is absolutely true. Trying to chase 2 rabbits and getting neither. So I've spoken to him in the podcast before. It's really 2 steps: buy an asset for capital growth when you first purchase that asset. After you own it, then start to tilt towards income and do everything else to improve its cash flow perspective. Hotspotting, it's about reducing risk and trying to achieve the highest return for lowest risk. So invest in areas where it's proven to generate long-term returns. And if you feel like you're getting excited, well, someone's dangling a carrot of really great short-term returns, have a look at the longer-term returns, because that's the thing that you really need to think about. And keep those personal preferences out of it. Something we spend a bit of time talking to clients about. Let Jared do his thing. We've given him the budget. Let him spend up to, if it's necessary, that budget that we've determined, and it's really about getting a great asset. So just before we leave you tonight, please subscribe to the channel. Hopefully I'll do more of these things if people have enjoyed it. And follow Jared's podcast, Rewarding Property Decisions. I personally listen to the podcast very regularly. I listened to the one of Villa Units. It was really good, Jared. And his business, wakeland.com.au. So if you want to reach out to him, and shortly, whether it's tonight or tomorrow, you'll receive an email. We'll ask for a bit of feedback there. So if you've got any other topics you'd like to hear us talk about, please let us know, and we'd love to receive your feedback. But Jared, I'm sure you've got a lot better things to do tonight, but thank you very much for sharing your time. And we really appreciate it. It's been really fun talking to you.
Always enjoy it, Stuart. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks for everyone listening.